The topic we're going to discuss this morning is one that I am far from an expert on. Make no mistake about it, I don't hold myself to be an expert in the area of Judaism and Christianity, the history of Christianity, Christian theology, or anything as such. But it's a topic that interested me and I was curious about, and I researched it, and I want to provide you somewhat of an overview to become somewhat literate on some of the key issues. How Judaism views Christianity from a philosophical standpoint, and then tackling some of the practical applications of Judaism's view of Christianity. Can one enter a church, and so on and so forth. I have actually an extensive source book on the topic. When I submitted it, unfortunately, it had to be somewhat condensed for the purposes of our handouts. If anyone is interested afterwards, I'm happy to email the extensive version of all of the sources. Let me know, and I'm happy to send it to you over email. But our topic really begins with a little bit of background, a little context, a little bit of history. Jesus, during his lifetime, it's very controversial. First of all, I'll be referring to him by his name, Jesus. I know that in itself is somewhat controversial. I'll just refer you to the Vilna Gaon, the Gra. Rav Eliyahu Kramer, in his comment on Shulchan Aruch, tells us that it's perfectly permissible to refer to him as Jesus. Yeshu, that was his Hebrew name when he was called up for an aliyah. That was the name that he was called by. And of course, his second name is one that we don't use. But to use his name is his Jewish name that his Jewish mother, when she called him for dinner, she said, Yeshua, come for supper, it's ready. So there's nothing wrong with our using that name. So Jesus, during his own lifetime, it's unclear exactly what his vision for this religion was. He was an observant man himself who embraced observant Judaism, led an observant life. And what his goals were in having deviated from traditional Judaism is somewhat unclear. What is clear is that Christianity was not born until generations later. It wasn't during his lifetime that his teachings began to promulgate and spread and to form and mold themselves into what was a new religion. It was only later when the Apostle Paul, himself a Jew, converted really spread the teachings and forged that religion that we know today as Christianity. Paul himself was not a contemporary of Jesus, never met him. It wasn't until years later. During the Tannaitic period, during the period of our early rabbis, the authors of the Mishnah, during the Tannaitic period that ends around the 2nd century, the question of Jewish-Christian relations didn't really come up. When you look throughout the Mishnah, you don't see it, although we'll examine a Mishnah momentarily, because the Tanaim, our great rabbis of the Mishnah, viewed Jews who were living Christian lives were still Jews. Yisrael afa pishachata Yisraelu. A Jew, even if they seek to convert, it's an impossibility. It's categorically impossible. There's no such thing. There's no reality. One's born a Jew. One is always a Jew. And so a Jew who had converted, so to say, to Christianity, who was married to a Jew, would be obligated to give a get. The marriage would not automatically dissolve through their conversion, because they would remain a Jew. And in other examples, they would remain a Jew. A non-Jew who embraced Christianity was treated as a non-Jew. It didn't matter if they embraced an early version of Christianity that had Jewish underpinnings, despite any association with Judaism or Christianity as an outgrowth of Judaism. If they were born a non-Jew, the halachic status was a non-Jew. So our early rabbis, the rabbis of the Mishnah, the Tanaim, don't develop a long analysis of Jewish-Christian relations or Judaism's view of Christianity, because it was a simple equation. A Jew was always a Jew no matter how they lived their life, even if they sought to convert. And a non-Jewish Christian had the status of a non-Jew even if they sought to embrace elements of Judaism in their Christianity. It's only by the destruction of the Second Temple that we just mourned just a short time ago, by the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, it is only a minority of Christians who are Jewish Christians. I think a fascinating question to ask, well beyond the scope of our time this morning, and frankly well beyond my competency in this area, is if Christianity began among the Jewish people and was observed primarily by Jews, when did Christians become non-Jews? If a Jew, even living a Christian life, remains a Jew, Yisrael alpha pishachati Yisraelu, well, when did Christianity become a religion or a people of non-Jews? When did that transition take place? And there's a lot written by scholars, Lawrence Schiffman and others on this issue, David Berger. But it's clear that by the time of the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, Jewish Christians were a minority of Christians. Christianity had spread and been embraced by the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. Some scholars suggest that the Roman Empire embraced Christianity because through it they really sought to embrace elements of Judaism. Despite their antagonism towards Judaism, obviously as we've felt and mourned just a few days ago on Tisha B'Av, the destruction of our holy Beis HaMikdash, the dispersion of Judaism into exile, our holy vessels now sitting in the Vatican in Rome, all things we mentioned in Kinos on Sunday morning. Despite the antagonism towards Judaism, there were elements and parts of Judaism that remained so attractive to the Roman Empire and to the people of the Roman Empire. Similar to what we're familiar with at the end of the story of Purim, Megillas Esther, that despite Haman's desire to annihilate and exterminate the Jewish people, when the Jews triumph and are victorious, many of the kingdom of Persia convert to Judaism, embrace Judaism, are inspired and elevated and motivated by Judaism. So the same, some scholars suggest, happened in the Roman Empire. They were attracted to elements of Judaism, but not all of Judaism. Giving up Saturdays, and cheeseburgers, and having to give up or to lead a richly observant, detailed, regulated, disciplined life. It's a challenge so many of our Jewish brothers and sisters today. Christianity offered Judaism light. It offered elements or components of a Judaism, but without the rigid structure and discipline and regulations and rules, and it was attractive and embraced and became the religion, and in many states became the religion of the state, the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. So by the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, it was a minority of Christians who were Jewish Christians that had been embraced by a much broader audience, and the majority of Christians were non-Jews. The real halachic analysis of a Jewish view of Christianity only emerges in the Middle Ages, when Christianity is a full-fledged religion, and it's a religion which has clearly defined itself not as a subsect of Judaism, but independent of it. And it's only then that we see an extensive halachic analysis of this issue. You have to realize early on, we don't find the question of is Christianity avodah zarah until the Middle Ages, until our Rishonim, because it wasn't really so relevant. A Christian didn't approach a rabbi to ask a halachic shaila. The Christian didn't knock on the door of the rabbi's study and say, I'm living a Christian life. I want to know from the Jewish tradition, is this a form of idolatry? Is this a violation of the 7 Noahide laws? So Christians weren't concerned with the Jewish view of Christianity. Christians weren't really concerned about much of Judaism other than until recent times. We'll get to, at the end, the whole question of can a Jew enter a church doesn't emerge until modern times, because it was unfathomable, incomprehensible. A Jew in the Middle Ages to electively or voluntarily go into a church, why would one do that? That was the equivalent of a Jew asking a halachic shaila, am I allowed to visit the Nazi headquarters? I heard they have wonderful artwork there. Christians slaughtered our people throughout the centuries and the millennia. There was zero desire, let alone the risk one took, to enter a church to view its magnificent artwork. So that question doesn't even arise until contemporary times, until recently. So certainly until the Middle Ages and during the Middle Ages, Christians weren't asking Jews for the Jewish opinion about Christianity. Christians weren't asking a halachic shaila, can they be active Christians? The question comes up about, can Jews relate to Christians, or do Christians have the status of idolaters as pagans? And there are limitations, which brings us to our opening source. The Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, in Tractate Avodah Zarah, teaches, the Mishnah teaches that 3 days prior to an idolatrous festival, one is forbidden to transact business with them. If you have on your calendar, you have a secular calendar, not the one you got from the Jewish cemetery, but the one that the church puts out, and on this idolatrous calendar they mark off a certain date, it's a certain pagan holiday. The Mishnah clearly stipulates a law. 3 days before that pagan holiday, no transactions. You can't sell to them or buy from them. You can't lend to them an object or borrow an object from them. You can't lend money to them or borrow from them. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees on one aspect, fascinating disagreement, not for now. You're allowed to be repaid, because the Mishnah says 3 days prior to this pagan holiday, you can't receive payment of a loan you extended to a pagan. What's the reason, by the way, for this rule? Because when the holiday comes and that pagan is sitting in their house of worship, thanking their pagan god, they're going to thank God for the business they did with that Jew within the last 3 days. The amazing deal they struck, the incredible negotiation they held, the wonderful business transaction. So we don't want to contribute to be an accomplice to that pagan worship, and therefore 3 days prior to the pagan holiday, hands off. No business with them. That includes accepting repayment of a loan from them. Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? Nobody wants to pay a loan back. That's not a source of joy. That's not a source of anything they'll give thanks for. And therefore you're allowed to receive payment for the loan. Amru lo, the Chachamim, this is a fascinating debate about finance, economics, economic theory. The Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. They say, yeah, nobody wants to pay back a loan. No one likes to write that check to the mortgage company every month. But, while you're repaying the debt, it's painful. But when you succeed, and at the end, and you become debt-free, that's a great source of joy. So there is a joy in becoming debt-free, and if you allow the pagan to become debt-free by repaying you, when they're in their pagan house of worship, thanking their God for being debt-free, you, the Jew, have contributed to the pagan worship. So the Mishnah clearly states, 3 days prior to a pagan holiday, hands off, you're not allowed to do business with them. Interestingly, Rashi, it's not in your source sheets, but Rashi in his comment on this Mishnah says, maybe it is in your source sheets. No, it's not. Rashi in his comment on this Mishnah says, and when did Rashi live? Rav Shlomo Yitzchaki, Rashi, our great commentary, without whom the Gemara, the Talmud, would be a closed book. Someone said to me recently, who was the first to learn Gemara with Rashi? Rashi's father. He learned Gemara every day with Rashi. So Rashi lives from 1040 to 1105. The 11th century, very beginning of the 12th century. Where does he live? France. What's happening in France in the 11th century? Is it a pleasant place to live for a Jew? Are Christians treating the Jews well? There's something called the First Crusade taking place. Again, we just read about it during the keynotes on Tisha B'Av just a few days ago. The Pope calls for the liberation of Jerusalem from Islamic hands. Christians travel through Europe on their way to Israel, to Jerusalem, to liberate it from Islamic hands. But for joy, for recreational activity on the way to Israel, slaughter, pogroms, persecution, oppression, rape, pillage Jewish communities on the way. Before the Holocaust, the Crusades resonated for Jews as the greatest atrocity. The loss of countless lives and communities, the loss of incredible scholars, Rishonim, medieval commentaries, and so on. That's when Rashi's living. So Rashi writes on this Mishnah, Ein anu yecholim lahamid atzmeinu milis v'lisan yimayim shebeineim anu yoshvim uparnasaseinu mehem v'od mishum yira. Rashi already writes in the 11th century, we can't observe this Mishnah with our contemporary Christians. Why? Because we can't shut down our business for 3 days before every Christian holiday. The Jewish economy will shut down. And also because of fear. A Jewish, shopkeeper owns a store. The Jew comes in and he sells pizza and falafel and shawarma. The non-Jew comes in and he says, well, I looked at my calendar, it's 3 days. Sorry, no shawarma for you. That's not going to bode too well for the Jewish community. So Rashi already in the 11th century says this Mishnah is difficult to observe. But you see from the Mishnah is the law, you're not allowed to do business. So that begs the question. Not a question again from Christians, what's the Jewish view of Christianity, but from Jews. What is the status of Christianity? Is it paganism? Is it forbidden? Or is it monotheism? Is it forbidden? Does it have the status of idolatry and we therefore have to distance ourselves from them? We can't socialize, fraternize, we can't transact? Or is it not idolatry and we can continue to be able to have business relations with them? So if you look in source 4, the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Talmud, has another example of this issue. Gemara says, "Lo yigram la'acherim sheyidru b'shmo v'sheyikaimu b'shmo." You're not allowed to do business with an idolater who, if you have a financial dispute and they in a court of law are forced to take an oath to defend their position, will take the oath in the name of their pagan, of their idol. Misayele la'aved d'shmuel d'amar avua d'shmuel asal la'adam sheyasa shutfus im hanachri shamei yischayev lo shvua v'nishba v'avodah zara shelo v'atorah amra lo yishma apicha. So you can't forge a partnership. You can't be partners with an idolater, a pagan. Why? Because despite the best of intentions, many business partnerships dissolve, a dispute results, and in a court of law, they're going to swear they're right, and they're going to swear in the name of their God that they're right, and they'll end up swearing in the name of their idolatrous God. And again, you've contributed, you've been an accomplice to invoking the name of an idol. So again, begs the question, can you have a business partner who's a Christian? Can you have a real estate partner, a business partner who is a devout Christian? Or do they have the status of an idolater for whom the Talmud warns us one cannot enter a business? So Rabbeinu Tam, Rav Yaakov ben Meir, the grandson of Rashi, lives 1100 to 1171. In his commentary, in the commentary of Tosfos, on the side of the page here in Gemara Sanhedrin on this issue, says the following. For the sake of time, we're going to read in the English. Rabbeinu Tam writes, "It is permissible to cause a Gentile's oath through litigation with one's non-Jewish partner, because today all swear in the name of the saints to whom no divinity is ascribed. Even though they also mention God's name and have in mind in any event no idolatrous name is actually said, and they also have the creator of the world in mind." So what is Rabbeinu Tam saying? Rabbeinu Tam says, and again, Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, in the 12th century is living among Christians in France and in Germany, where the Franco-German Tosafists, the Balei HaTosfos, live. So he says, this Talmudic ruling about having a business partnership with an idolater does not apply to Christians. Why? Because they swear in the names that are saints to whom no divinity is ascribed. They're not swearing in the name of an idol, of a deity, of someone to whom divinity is ascribed. They're swearing in the name of a saint, A. And B, they don't have in mind any idolatrous name. They have the creator of the world in mind. Even when the Christian invokes the name of or the word God, whom are they talking about? The creator of the world. Says Rabbeinu Tam, the same creator of the world that we worship, whose name we invoke. And even though they associate God's name with something else, something Rabbeinu Tam writes called shituf, we do not find that it's forbidden to cause others to associate, and there's no issue of placing a stumbling block before the blind by entering litigation with non-Jewish business partner, causing him to take an oath. So Rabbeinu Tam's position on Christians is the following. It is not forbidden for a non-Jew to be a Christian. For a Gentile to embrace Christianity is not idolatry. Why? Because Christianity, this is at least the way the Ramah understands, Rav Moshe Isserlis and others, the Nodeb Yehuda, Rav Yechezkel Landa, argues that Tosfos is misunderstood by many. This is not what Rabbeinu Tam means. But let me give you the simple understanding. Is the following. What is shituf? Shituf is association. Christianity embraces something called Trinity. The Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, incarnation, is the idea that there is a creator of the universe, the same creator of the universe that we worship, who created all that is, who is omnipotent, who is infinite, who is beyond time, beyond space, who is all-powerful. And while we believe in the unity of that God, there is nothing else. Ein od milvado. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. All there is God. The oneness, the unity, the wholeness. Everything else that exists is an extension of God, but it all comes through the prism of God. Christianity believes in the Creator, but associates Him as having a Son and a Holy Ghost, a Holy Spirit. And without getting into the details of the Trinity, which again, I don't purport to be an expert in, they embrace this concept of shituf, of association. They associate other forces with God. In other words, they ascribe divine power to forces other than the creator of the universe. So if they believe in the omnipotence of the creator of the universe, but in addition they embrace shituf, which is the association or ascribing power, divine power, to other things, says Rabbeinu Tam, that is not idolatry for a Gentile. Shituf, association, is not defined as idolatry for a Gentile. So a Gentile who embraces Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, a Gentile who observes Christianity, who is a devout Christian, is not an idolater. They are not practicing idolatry. However, for a Jew, shituf is idolatry. In other words, Rabbeinu Tam introduces a very novel idea, that the very definition of avodah zarah, the very definition of idolatry is different for a non-Jew than it is for a Jew. So the non-Jew who embraces shituf, association, ascribes power, not idolatry. And therefore, when they swear in court, or if they're a business partner of yours, or their holidays on their calendar, you don't have to distance yourself from them. But for the Jew, that's a form of idolatry. If a Jew were to convert to or take on Christianity, that Jew would be practicing idolatry. That is the position of Rabbeinu Tam. That's the position of Tosfos. The Rambam, Maimonides disagrees. Maimonides says not only is shituf, the doctrine of the Trinity, not only is Christianity idolatry for the Jew, it's idolatry for the non-Jew as well. Now it is interesting to note where the Rambam lived versus where Rabbeinu Tam and his grandfather Rashi lived. Now God forbid, and I think this is a fundamental point to make, albeit a tangent, the halachic system, the traditional system, the Masorah, our Masorah, the covenantal community, we believe in a concept called Emunas Chachamim. Emunas Chachamim means faith in our sages. And that's a topic that could be developed for hours on end another time. But faith in our sages, in a very brief moment, means that we believe that our great rabbis arrived at their halachic conclusions because they felt it was truth, not because they were influenced by their surroundings. Did their circumstances, contemporary culture, neighbors, did it influence them? Undoubtedly it influenced them. Hillel certainly invented the pruzbul because people were not lending money before Shemitah. Is the pruzbul a compromise of halacha that Hillel invented because he needed to figure out a way for people to lend? No. It's a genuine, authentic mechanism in halacha. Was it inspired and motivated by the contemporary society he lived in? For sure. Absolutely. So similarly, Tosfos believed in what he believed. He arrived at the conclusion he arrived at because that was his analysis, that was his tradition. It is objective, it is sacred, it is part of our tradition. Was it influenced by the fact that he lived among Christians and it was certainly convenient to conclude that Christianity is not idolatry for them? That didn't shape his opinion, but certainly it made his conclusion convenient. The Rambam, where does the Rambam live? Among whom does the Rambam live? The Rambam lives primarily among Muslims, among Islam. And his conclusion about Christianity was easy for him to arrive at, would have been more difficult had he lived in France or Germany. It doesn't mean he wouldn't have arrived at it. Emunas Chachamim dictates that we believe that the Rambam would have arrived at this conclusion no matter where he lived on the globe, on earth. But it certainly was easier for him to arrive at living in the Muslim worlds and countries in which he lived. Writes the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah. Now, you have to be careful which edition of the Rambam you're reading, because our editions have been censored, just like our Talmud has been censored. Self-censored. The Jewish community ourselves censored. After enough disputations in the Middle Ages, and after enough burning of our books, as we just read about, that occurred in Paris, the keynotes we read about in Italy, after our Talmud, after 24 wagon loads were burnt to the ground, before the invention of the printing press, we learned to self-censor the selections that could result in a pogrom, death, the burning of our manuscripts. So anyway, in this edition of the Rambam, he writes the following. Rambam lives 1135 to 1204. He migrates often. He was in Spain and Egypt, ultimately in Tzfat in Israel. So the Rambam writes, The Edomites, Christians, Hanotzrim, Ovdei Avodah Zarahim, they are full-fledged, bona fide idolaters. V'yom Rishon hu Yom Edam, and Sunday is their festival, Sunday is their holiday. Lefichach asar laseis v'laseis imayim be'eretz Yisrael, Yom Chamishi v'Yom Shishi, shebechol Shabbos v'Shabbos, ve'ein tzarech lomar Yom Rishon atzmo shu asar b'chol makom, v'chei noagan imayim b'chol eidehem. So the Rambam Maimonides writes, Christians are idolaters, invoking the rule we saw earlier, you cannot do business, transact, fraternize with them 3 days before their holiday. Their holiday is not once or twice or 3 times a year. It is every Sunday. And therefore, says the Rambam, Thursday, Friday, obviously our Shabbos, and their Sunday, no work, no business with a non-Jew. That's what Rashi was alluding to. There's no way we could do that in France. So the Rambam writes explicitly that Christianity is full-fledged, bona fide, and absolute idolatry. Now that said, and he also writes this in his letter to the people of Yemen, of Taiman. It's in the bottom of page 4. You have it, and page 5. I'm not going to take the time to read it now. But the Rambam's analysis is Christianity is full-fledged idolatry, and therefore invokes the rules that we discussed, apply to idolatry, fraternization, transactions, business, distancing ourselves, their wine, and so on and so forth. I will just tell you that the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim, and you have it here in your sources, page 6 and 7, and this is the uncensored version of the Rambam. The Kapach edition of the Rambam is the uncensored version of the Rambam. The Rambam does have some positive things to say about Christianity, despite his applying a status of idolatry to it. The Rambam writes that, of course, our whole goal, the Jewish people's whole purpose, our mission in the world, was to introduce our great-great-great-grandfather Avraham Avinu, who himself introduced the world to ethical monotheism, passed on to us, his progeny, that mission, to teach the world ethical monotheism, to teach the world to be a light unto nations, to teach the world a proper relationship with time and space, and relationships and food, and temptation and physical pleasure, and so on and so forth. The Rambam does say that Christianity and Islam are both progress towards that goal. And so while Christianity is idolatry for the Rambam, he does see it at least as achieving some incremental form of progress towards the realization of the goal of seeing God, the God who is the creator of the universe, as our God. And he writes, Af Yeshua Hanotzri. Note, by the way, the Rambam was not afraid to call him by his name. The Talmud, in the uncensored versions, is not afraid to call him by his name. I always marvel that some are afraid to use the name Jesus or Yeshu. What would they do if they're learning the Rambam in the back of the shul? Because it's a shul, they won't mention his name? If they're learning that section of the Gemara, if they're learning the Gra, the Vilna Gaon's commentary on Shulchan Aruch. Anyway, as an aside, the Rambam was not afraid to call him Yeshu. That was his Jewish name. That's how he was called up to the Torah. Shadima Shiyeh Mashiach v'nerag b'Bezdin. He thought he was the Messiah. He was killed. Kvar Niznaved by Daniel. The prophet Daniel already had prophecy about him. But nevertheless, the Rambam does say that it represents progress towards the realization of God, who is the creator of the universe. I'll just, we don't have time to develop, the Rambam's view of Islam. Is Islam idolatry for the Rambam? Absolutely not. The Rambam says Islam is complete monotheism, because Islam embraces the same God as us, the creator of the universe, and despite their erroneous conclusion about a certain man as being a prophet, that he's not only the greatest prophet, he's not a prophet at all, but from the perspective of weighing their deity, the divinity, they subscribe to the same God, creator of the universe, as we, and the Rambam concludes that Islam is monotheistic, it is not pagan, it's not idolatrous. There are those who disagree and even see Islam as paganistic as well, but therefore the Rambam concludes, and many contemporary halachic poskim, there's no halachic prohibition to enter a mosque. The Rambam writes explicitly, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, convert to Christianity or die, which today is a theoretical question, but for the last 2,000 years was among the most practical that was asked on a daily basis to Jews. Today we are not have a gun against our head. Instead, there are ads taken out by Jews for Jesus and missionaries who've come up with much more subtle and conniving and nuanced ways of trying to convert us. rather than threatening us. But if someone puts a gun against your head and says, convert to Christianity or die, what is the halachic conclusion for the Rambam? One must die. What's the halachic conclusion for Rabbeinu Tam? One must die. Because for a Jew it's idolatry. Avodah Zarah is one of the 3 cardinal sins. One must concede their life before worshiping an idol. But for the Rambam, if a person puts their gun against your head and says, convert to Islam or die, the Rambam writes explicitly, one may superficially give the appearance of converting to Islam. Not only that, there are historical scholars who suggest, based on some evidence, that the Rambam himself and his family at one point converted to Islam. Hard to imagine. The great Rambam. Not, God forbid, that he actually converted to Islam, but gave the appearance of conversion in order to buy time necessary to flee for his life and to migrate, which is what he ultimately did. Others suggest, well, even if Islam is not idolatry, but Islam does not accept the divine nature of the Torah and Torah Sheba'al Peh, so one still should have to die rather than convert, and therefore many argue, but that's the Rambam's position of Islam, which again, Emunas Chachamim dictates that we don't believe the Rambam came to that conclusion because he lived among Muslims, but certainly it was a convenient conclusion to come to living among Muslims. So we've seen Rabbeinu Tam's position that Christianity is not idolatry for Gentiles, but is idolatry for Jews. The Rambam's position that Christianity is idolatry for everyone and one must die. And interestingly, which one of them is embraced? How do we paskin? So if you look, and this I think is fascinating, one of my teachers, Rabbi J.J. Schachter at Yeshiva University, pointed this out, at least to me. We have a Ramah in source 13. The Ramah quotes this rule, this law that we have about distancing ourselves from idolatry, from idolatrous practice, from idolatrous items of worship. And if you look in our Ramah, source 13, Rav Moshe Isser, not source 13, I'm sorry, I'm looking in the wrong source book. In your source book, you don't have it. But if you want it, email me and I'm happy to send it to you. So I'll tell it to you very quickly. In our version of the Ramah says just that you have to distance yourself from idolatry. No reference to Christianity. And he refers us to a Trumas Hadeshin. The Trumas Hadeshin was written by Rabbi Yisrael Isserlin. He lived in the 14th and 15th centuries, 1390 to 1460 in Germany. In Siman Kuf Tzadi Hey, 195, chapter 195 of the Trumas Hadeshin's responsa. If you open one of our Trumas Hadeshins today and you look up chapter 195, you will find chapter 194, and what will you find immediately after it? Chapter 196. Chapter 195 was taken out by the censors. But if you look in earlier versions of the Ramah, and I have an edition, again, I'm happy to send you these sources, that was published in Vienna in 1808, a later edition which quotes the earlier version of the Ramah, who himself lived in the 16th century. It says, the Ramah, B'yom ches sha'achar nittel shekora naya yor. The 8th day after nittel. What's nittel? What date on the calendar is nittel nacht? The eve of December 25th. What's 8 days after nittel nacht? New Year's, naya yor. Sheyesh lem simin magia lehem doron b'chag. The Ramah quoting the Trumas Hadeshin is a whole discussion. Can you give a gift, a holiday gift, to a Christian during holiday season? Are they an idolater for whom you're forbidden to give a gift during their holiday season when they're going to thank their God? And the Ramah quoting the Trumas Hadeshin references Nittel and Naya Yor, New Year's. I mean, it's also ironic when a Jew celebrates New Year's. For Christians, what is New Year's? What's 8 days after the birth of a Jewish baby boy? So Naya Yor, what it stands for in Christian theology, and Nittel and so on, and of course it's another topic for another time. I have extensive short source sheets if anyone wants. The whole concept of Nittel Nacht, of Jews, the practice of Jews refraining from learning Torah on the eve of December 25th. What's its basis and where does it find itself? Fascinating articles written about this. Anyway, this Trumas Hadeshin, the Ramah, do make reference to this question. So we have the Rabbeinu Tam's position. We have very little time left. We have Rabbeinu Tam's position. We have the Rambam's position. And now a third position. And this is a critically important position. And that is the position of Rav Menachem Meiri. The Meiri who lives 1249 to 1310. It's on the bottom of your page 8, top of your page 9. The Meiri who lives as well in Ashkenaz, the Meiri writes the following. It seems to me that these matters all pertain only to worship of idols and their forms and images, but that nowadays these commercial activities are wholly permitted. Among Christians, it's not a problem today. Again, the rules limiting fraternization, transactions, and so on don't apply today to contemporary Christians. As for the statement in the Talmud, a Christian is always forbidden to be traded with. Now, the translator writes Christian. He doesn't write that. It says Notzri. Milashon Notzrim. He says, the word Notzri I interpret as being derived from watchers who come from a far country. As stated in Yirmiyahu, refers to Notzrim are from the Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar. Now this is a very creative interpretation of the Meiri. Nobody else offers it. It's a very novel and creative interpretation. Notzri means Christian. The Meiri says no, Notzri doesn't mean Christian. Notzri means the followers and descendants of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, and their pagan religion. That's what you have to distance yourself from. But Christians, it's not a problem. Not a problem. And why is it not a problem? So the Meiri writes elsewhere, a language, that Christians are not idolaters. When the Torah forbids us from interacting or transacting or fraternizing with pagans, it means those who have no ethical, moral code regulating their life. Those whose lives are not enhanced or regulated by religious doctrine or religious ethical thinking. But, and this is the lashon of the Meiri, a nation governed by religion is not paganism, is not idolatry, says Rav Menachem Meiri. So even if Christians embrace Trinity and Incarnation, ideas that are absolutely foreign to Judaism, and even if in theory they are forms of idolatry from the perspective of idolatry, from the perspective of their status and the rules that govern our relationship with them, Christians have the status of a nation governed by religion. And as such, a nation governed by religion, we are not obligated to distance ourselves from them. The Meiri's position is that Christianity is not only not idolatry for a Christian, Christianity is not idolatry, not for a Jew, that a Jew, God forbid, could embrace Christianity. But a Jew's connection or association or attitude towards Christianity is not idolatry. They are a nation governed by religion, in the words of the Meiri. It's quoted by the Ber Agola, the bottom of your page 9, of Moshe Rivkis, the 17th century, again in the English. The rabbi said this in relation to pagans of their own times only, who worshipped stars and constellations and did not believe in the Exodus or in creation ex nihilo. But the peoples in whose shade we, the people of Israel, are exiled, and amongst whom we are dispersed, do in fact believe in creation ex nihilo, and in the Exodus, and in the main principles of religion. And their whole aim and intent is to the maker of heaven and earth. So far then, from our not being forbidden to save them, we are on the contrary obliged to pray for their welfare. Hence we stand on guard to pray continually for the welfare and success of the kingdom and the ministers and so on and so forth. So he says, pagans, they don't believe in the Exodus, in Chumash, in Torah, in Har Sinai, in the Jewish people. Christians embrace Torah. Tragically, in our time, there are more Christians who believe in the binding nature of Chumash than there are Jews. Tragically, percentage-based. So Christians do not fit that model of pagan, says the Meiri. So we have three different opinions. Rabbeinu Tam, and the Rambam, and the Meiri. Who do we follow? Who do we follow? Now for a long time the Meiri was considered a Das Yachid. For many, many years the Meiri was considered a singular opinion, not embraced by the community or by the halachic system. Christianity is idolatry, we have to distance ourselves from it. But I want to share with you a number of very interesting sources in more contemporary times. And again, I can't help but say shaped by a new era of Jewish-Christian relations and so on, a different Christian church who, at least now, Rabbi Soloveitchik felt very strongly. There's a collection of Rabbi Soloveitchik's letters and essays that came out, and in there he has a whole chapter on interfaith relations. Rabbi Soloveitchik spoke very strongly against interfaith relations and dialogue and cooperation on theological issues. On issues of pragmatism, where we can work together, work together. But on theological, philosophical issues, he was vehemently against it. And he cautioned very strongly that even though in the recent decades Christian-Jewish relations have been wonderful, and the Pope has taken on, the Church has taken on, based on Vatican II, a new approach to Jewish people, Rabbi Soloveitchik cautions very strongly to be very careful to what degree we let down our guard. But nevertheless, there is a new era of those relations. And it's not the same time of our lives being threatened, and crusades and pogroms and forced conversions, and even cooperating with the Nazis. So if you look at a number of sources, you don't have them, I'm going to read to you a few of them first. The Rav Kook, Rav Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, 1865-1935, the first chief rabbi of Israel, writes in his Igros, in his writings, Levad ma she'ha'ikar kedasa me'iri she'kol ha'amim she'im gedurim b'nimusim agunim bein adam l'chavero hen kvar nachshavam l'garim toshavim b'chol chiyuvei ha'adam. In his writings, he references that we embrace the perspective of the Meiri. That the rabbi's idea of paganism, of idolatry, were unregulated barbarians, were boors who simply did whatever they wanted but had no ethical, moral code. But Christians who are bound by a religious code, which in very many ways is similar to ours, a Judeo-Christian ethic, they do not have the status of idolaters. Thus writes Rav Kook. Rav Yaakov Emden, the great Rav Yaakov Emden, 1697-1776, in his parish, L'Seder Olam, writes similarly. Rav Yitzchak Ivy Alevi Herzog, one of the chief rabbis of Israel, 1888-1959, also writes, Kosher ken she'umos ha'olam shebizmanenu einam ovdei avodah zara, kosher adoros miskadmin ne'akeres yosef avodah zara milibam. Today's non-Jews are not idolaters. He's talking about Christians and Muslims, not necessarily talking about Eastern religions. And he says the more we progress and the more we... You see, what he's essentially saying about the Meiri is the Meiri introduced the idea that for the rabbis, paganism were uncivilized people. And the more people are civilized, the less they are idolaters. And the more we progress, this is an arguable point, and become more civilized, the less they are viewed to be idolaters. Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, and this you do have on the bottom of page 10 on page 11, in his book called Logic of the Heart, Logic of the Mind, Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, Yeshiva's Brisk in Chicago, as well as Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, a grandson of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik's brother. So in his book also writes extensively about our relationship with the Christian world today, and references and embraces the Meiri and the Meiri's approach. The Tzitz Eliezer of Eliezer Waldenberg on the bottom of page 11, November 15th, 1965, also embraces the Meiri's approach. This comes from a correspondence that Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg had with a Reform rabbi who was a contemporary of his. There's in the Torah Madda journal, it was printed, a number of the correspondence. Rabbi Atlas, there was a Reform rabbi who was a contemporary of this. Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg was the Sridei Eish. He lived 1884 to 1966, ultimately in Switzerland, but earlier in Germany. He was trained as a Rav in Germany, in Switzerland, in Israel. He is the author of the Tshuvos, the responses, Sridei Eish, one of the great halachic minds of the early 20th century. Sridei Eish had a very cordial relationship with a contemporary of his who was a Reform rabbi, Rabbi Atlas. Reform rabbi then meant something very different. So Rabbi Atlas was an incredible Talmud Chacham. In fact, the Ritva that we have on Baba Basra today, the scholarship was done by Rabbi Atlas, though his name doesn't appear in our editions of the Ritva on Baba Basra. So Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Sridei Eish's correspondence, which were very cordial and halachic discussions with Rabbi Atlas, were printed in a volume of the Torah Madda journal. It set off some controversy. There was a question: would the Sridei Eish have wanted these responses made public? Maybe these were a series of letters that were private. Maybe he didn't want it shared publicly that he had this relationship and shared this correspondence. So the individual who published them went to the Sridei Eish's kever in Yerushalayim, begged forgiveness. It's a whole fascinating discussion unto itself. But anyway, in this letter, November 15th, 1965, Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg is writing from Switzerland to Rabbi Atlas and bemoans the state of affairs among the Orthodox, or what he'll consider the ultra-Orthodox. And he writes in the middle paragraph, The chief rabbis of Israel treat me with honor. Rav Unterman writes me chidushim, his questions and his problems. He's burdened with the duty of defending traditional life. In Israel, they speak with excitement about Rabbi Dr. Soloveitchik. He protested against those who wish to approach the Vatican and are attempting to secure from it words of conciliation with regard to Judaism. In my opinion, this final paragraph, this is the point. In my opinion, it is fitting to put an end to the hatred of the religions for each other. More than Christianity hates Judaism, at this point, Judaism hates Christianity. There's a dispute of stealing from Gentiles forbidden from the Torah. Everyone holds that deceiving a Gentile as canceling his debt is permitted. One is not to return a lost object to a Gentile. According to Rabbeinu Tam, intercourse with a Gentile does not render a woman forbidden to her husband. According to Maimonides, if a Jew has sex with a Gentile woman, the Gentile is killed because the Jew stumbled and sinned through her. The law of the Gentile is the same as that of an animal. Maimonides derived this law on his own. We must solemnly and formally declare that in our day, this does not apply. Meiri wrote as such, but the teachers and Ramim whisper in the ears of the students that all this was written because of the censor. So Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the great Sridei Eish, embraces the position of the Meiri, believes that Christianity today is not an idolatrous practice to which all of those rules that he references applies, says that even though in yeshiva circles we dismiss the Meiri and say the Meiri only wrote that because he was afraid and because of the censors, he writes it's not true. The Meiri's position is the correct one, and it is how we should follow. Rav Chaim David Halevi, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, also writes similarly in source on page 13. And that is the first part, as we have a few minutes left, of what I thought would be our lecture today, the Jewish view of Christianity. Rabbeinu Tam's position, the Rambam's position, the Meiri's position, and that in contemporary times, it seems many authorities embrace the Meiri's position. What about now applying this to contemporary circumstances? Is a Jew allowed to enter a church? And this comes up in many ways. Any Jew that goes on a trip, a vacation to Italy, to Rome, is going to be tempted to visit magnificent structures with incredible artwork. Can a Jew enter a church to see them? Can a Jew enter a church to volunteer in a soup kitchen? Can a Jew enter a church in order to vote, if that's where the voting in their district is being held? Can a Jew enter a church? And as I mentioned earlier, this is a question that could only come up in our times. Before the last 100 years, a Jew would never ask, could I enter a church? They would have zero desire. They would be risking their lives. It can only be a contemporary question. So very briefly, a little bit of an overview of this question. The Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, and again, you don't have many of these sources now, but I'm happy to share them with you. The Mishnah in Avodah Zarah says that a person is forbidden from entering a house of idolatry. Not only entering a house, you're not allowed to walk on the street as a shortcut, same side of the street as a place of idolatrous worship. Why is that? According to some opinions, according to Rashi, it's because it's Maras Ayin. Someone might erroneously conclude that you are going to worship that idol. The Ritva, Rav Yom Tov ben Avram, one of the Rishonim, disagrees. The Ritva says no, because just your passing by affords honor to that idol, and therefore you are forbidden to go there. The Shulchan Aruch codifies this in Yerodeh Mitzvah lahisrachik miderech elilim daled amos. You're not allowed to go within 6 feet of a house of idolatry. 6 feet, daled amos. You have to stay away. What about a church? Is a church considered a house of idolatry that you have to stay away? So again, Rabbeinu Tam said that Christianity is not avodah zarah for the non-Jew. Good. But what about as a Jew? From the Jewish perspective, Rabbeinu Tam said that Christianity is avodah zarah. And based on this, all halachic authorities that I saw, I could not find anybody who's lenient, forbid Jews from entering a church. We'll talk about exceptions in a moment. But electively to enter a church simply to appreciate its artwork. Not only are you not allowed to enter a church, Rav Hershel Schechter, in his intellectual biography of Rav Soloveitchik called Nefesh Harav, writes, he remembers, Kishenirtzach HaNasi Kennedy, when JFK was murdered, his funeral was held in a cathedral. Even Jews, many in America, were watching Kennedy's funeral on television. And Rabbi Soloveitchik spoke very strongly against it. He said even to watch a Christian service in a church is forbidden, even through television. Not only is one forbidden from entering, but from participating in a Christian or Catholic service, even through a television, even streamed online, is something which is forbidden. The Rav Moshe has a tshuva, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Yoredeya, Chela Gimel. Osar afli kanes rak lahabit bitzuros shahayu yiduim shirak lenoi na'asu. It is forbidden to enter a church, even if it is just to see the artwork with no intent of worship, because that building nevertheless has the status for a Jew as a house of idolatry. Again, for the non-Jew, for the Gentile, it's not idolatry, but for the Jew it is, and therefore a Jew is forbidden from entering. And he writes in another tshuva similarly. Rav Avadia Yosef, former Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, today a great halachic authority, not only for Sephardim but beyond, also writes, Hadavar barur she'asur behechleit levaker b'knesiyot shel notrim. It is clear as day, says the Rav Avadia, it is forbidden from entering a church. V'amadrichei tayarot lihishamer v'lizaher ma'od l'ba yikashlu v'lo yachshilu Yehudim ha'mevakrim b'Yisrael. Rav Avadia is dealing with Jewish tours in Israel who want to go visit churches in the Old City and elsewhere in Israel. And he says Jewish tour guides have to be vigilant and careful not to bring Jewish groups into churches. Sheyesh b'zeh iser mishum lifnei iver lo titein mechshol v'leshomim minayim v'aleim tavo bracha tov. Says Rav Avadia, like Rav Moshe, like the Rav, it's forbidden. The Tzitz Eliezer of Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the posek of Shari Tzedek Hospital, a great posek in Yerushalayim, who lived 1915 to 2006, also has a long tshuva, and writes similarly. He recalls from his youth, Zechroni od mi'imei katnusi, dikshahayu tzrichem lavor al yad knesiyah muvheka shalahem, hayu ha'mevugarim mi'itzim banu lo lehistakel lasham, ulamaher la'avor u'v'derech ha'mehiris lomar gimel pamim, shaketz t'shaktzenu. He says, I remember from my youth, if we had to pass a prominent church, that we were taught to look away, not even look in the direction of the church, and to repeat 3 times, shaketz t'shaktzenu. And he therefore also obviously comes to the conclusion, you're not even allowed to go to the courtyard. Let's say it's raining outside and you want to go under a canopy of a church in order to find cover. It is forbidden even to find cover. The church has the status of a house of idolatry from a Jewish perspective, and one is forbidden. Rav Shlomo Aviner, who is alive today, halachic posek of the National Religious Party in Israel, he's the Rosh Yeshiva of Ateres Kohanim and the Rav of Beit El. So in his Tshuvos She'ela Shlomo he writes, what if you want to go on the roof of a church to take a great picture of a shul? Right? In the old, where would that happen? Not it's not happening at the Bonaventure or Boca Raton, but in the old city of Yerushalayim, the Ir Atikah could very easily happen. A Jew wants to ascend to the roof of the church because that's the best place to take the picture of Har HaBayis, of the Kotel, of the old city. Writes Rav Aviner, Tipos abeis avodah zarah shel notzrim k'dei lisponein b'shetach o l'tzaleim nir b'pashtras she'aser. Neshe beis avodah zarah aser b'hana. You're not allowed to derive benefit from a house of idolatry. So even though you're not worshiping, you're not even entering, but you're deriving benefit of a better perspective, a better angle for your camera to view the old city, he writes it's something which is forbidden. So to enter a church electively, to view the artwork, or to have a better perspective, every halachic source that I found, I struggle to find any source that permits. If you've come across, I'm happy to know it. The only semi-exception I found is from Rav Levi Yitzchak Halpern. Rav Levi Yitzchak Halpern today is the head of a institute for halacha and technology, a great Talmud Chacham. And in a journal called Pninei Hora'ah, he writes the following: Nira shebeknesiya katolit shenepeches lemuseum ha'anashim einam ba'am le'espal sham mutar lamadrich la'achnis metayalim l'sham. If you have what used to be a church, which is converted to a museum, and it no longer is being visited for worship, there's no services, there's no ceremonies, there's no Catholic practices taking place there at all, it has the status of a museum, that he says it's permissible to enter and permissible to view. That's the only exception that I found. You have like that in New York, near Washington Heights. What do you have? What's it called there? The cloisters. Is that what it's called? I forget what it's called. Cloisters. So it's no longer an active church. It's been converted into a museum, so that may be permissible to enter. But a church which is active and has worship is forbidden to enter, and would be forbidden to enter even for a funeral. I get the question often as a rabbi. People have coworkers, they have dear friends. It seems grossly insensitive to not go to a funeral. And of course we try to create the ultimate Kiddush Hashem that we can, sanctification of God's name. And my suggestion is that one go. Try to be there earlier so you greet the person on their way in. You wait outside, and you're there to greet them on the way out. And ultimately, if it comes to the question, how come you couldn't come in? I go to your synagogue for your kid's bar mitzvah, you can't enter my church. It's a very uncomfortable and difficult position to be in as a Jew. It's more comfortable than the Crusades, but it's an uncomfortable and difficult position to be in. It's still a difficult position to be in as a Jew, but those are the moments of truth. Those are the moments as Jews that we face in which we have to forfeit and concede our will and our understanding to that of God. And those are the moments that forge our identity. And so with great sensitivity and care and concern, we have to try to express our tenets of our religion. But that's what I tell people. What about entering a church in order to vote? This question was posed to Rav Moshe Sternbach. Rav Moshe Sternbach lives today in Yerushalayim, but Rav Moshe Sternbach beforehand was a great halachic authority in South Africa. And in his Tshuvas V'Hanhagos, his extensive response was asked, the election was being held, the voting booth in a church, could you go in? And he writes, "Benidon didon di'efshar v'loka mechaven lo matzasi shum makom le'asor l'shtatef b'bechiros l'fi ma she'evanti she'apesach le'beis avodah zarah atzma eino ha'pesach le'ulam." He says you could vote in a church as long as you're not entering the sanctuary where they worship. So if the voting is being held in a room of the church other than where you worship, and there's a side entrance to the church, or you enter the main entrance, but there's a banner or sign that voting is being held there. In other words, it's clear to all that you're not there in the capacity of a church, but you're there to vote. He permits entering the church. And he has another tshuva similarly. He says, let's say you have a flea market. You have a fruit and vegetable market being held in the courtyard of a church. Are you allowed to shop in the flea market, in the fruit and vegetable market outside the church? He says, "Lefi zakan she'en chashash gam lamaras ayin ein ani roa makom le'esor afilu kir ein kan kishenikar she'en kavanah lebeis avodah zarah klal." It's outside the church. It's clear through signage and the booths themselves that this is not about worship. He permits one to shop at a flea market or at a sale taking place in the courtyard outside of a church. Another interesting question that was posed to the Munkatcher Rav, the Minchas Eluzar, Rav Chaim Elazar Shapira, the Munkatcher Rebbe. So the Munkatcher Rebbe was asked, in Munkach, you have a clock tower, you want to know what time it was. In Munkach, not everyone could afford a timepiece, a wonderful watch or a timepiece that hung from a chain. You want to know what time it was, you looked up at the clock tower. And where was the clock tower held? On what building? The church. Could you tell time by the clock on the tower of the church? That was the question posed to the Minchas Eluzar, to the Munkatcher Rav, and he answered, yes, absolutely, one is permitted. Other interesting questions that come up vis-a-vis. What about, what's the status of a cross? Could a Jew be in the business of manufacturing and selling crosses? Is a cross considered an item, an object of idolatry that a Jew is forbidden from gaining profit from? Or is a cross not an item of idolatry? So the Rama writes in Shulchan Aruch, Osan shetolam betzavar lezichron lo mikreit selam umutter. Again, the Rama is referencing Christianity. That which is hung from the neck is for design and not for worship. People don't bow down and worship the cross that hangs as jewelry. It's only there as jewelry, and as such, the Rama writes, it is permissible. Can a Jew wear a sweatshirt or a t-shirt that has a cross? Now, what Jew would possibly want to wear a t-shirt or a sweatshirt that has a cross? So the answer is, if they're a fan of what team? The New Orleans Saints. The emblem or logo of that team is essentially a cross. If you're a fan of the New Orleans Saints, could you wear clothing that has a cross? So this was asked of Rav Moshe Sternbach, not about the New Orleans Saints. Even for Christians today, a cross is part of jewelry, it's part of dress, it's design, it's not object of worship. So therefore, if a person purchases clothing that have it, it's not a problem. Similarly, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked, if a person has a stamp, I'm ending with this, if a person has stamps that have a cross on them, you're a stamp collector, or the stamps you happen to purchase have a cross, could you use such stamps? Rav Moshe writes, Yesh medina shemitziyarim al stamps, chomrim v'shesi v'arev shalahem imutal al-lischor b'zeh. Can you be a stamp dealer and sell them? V'aniyaz daiti ein lesor. It's not forbidden because they're only for design and not for more. Now there's one other exception we don't have time to develop, and that is, can a Jew enter? We have chief rabbis of England who entered cathedrals and churches in their capacity of cheap rabbi. Whereas if they didn't, and they antagonized the Christian community, it put the Jewish community at risk. That's a din called Karav L'Malchus. It's a whole separate sugya, a whole separate issue, which we clearly don't have time for today. So to summarize, what we saw, I'm glad that my balabatim don't do this on Shabbos morning. What we summarize, what we saw is the Jewish view of Christianity is complex. It's not simple. The question didn't arise early, it only came up when Christianity formed in the early Middle Ages. But we have a debate between Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi, the Rambam Maimonides, and the Meiri, the status of Christianity, is it idolatry or not? Many contemporaries seem to embrace the perspective of the Meiri, that Christianity promotes civilized religion. It is a nation-based, it's a people based on religion, and therefore it would not be idolatry. But in our halachic practice, we embrace the idea that while Christianity is not idolatry for Gentiles, it remains for Jews, and therefore universally, contemporary halachic authorities forbid entering a church, with the exception of voting or let's say an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, as long as one does not enter the actual sanctuary and comes through a side door, if there's signage that there are other activities that are happening there. Again, we barely scratched the surface of what is a complex but important topic. Thank you so much for having me, and again, kol hakavod for spending this time learning.